Welcome back to the Inspiring Leadership Book Club. I'm your intrepid host, Andrew Cohn, and we're here to learn about this wonderful new book. Came out in 2021 called The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. Very interesting book. If you see me distracted here, I've got the book in front of me. I have my iPad with my notes, and I have a little study guide here next to me as well. So I'll try to keep looking up at the screen as I go through this. There's a fair amount to cover in this book. It's a very interesting book. This is there may be different editions of the book. Sometimes that happens, but this is the book that I've got. This is a collection of different threads of research having to do with the brain, with our thinking, with how we think, what helps us think better. And there are different threads of research that are assembled under three categories, three headings, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And what I'd say in talking about this book is that there's a lot of stories, a lot of research that's cited. There are 80 pages of notes, citations in the back of the book. And there's just a lot here. So I'm going to focus on the things that I think are most useful and most interesting to me and my clients. And I'm certainly open, as always, to talk with any of you about any questions you might have about how else we could use this material, or something you saw that said, hey, what did you think about this section or that section? Certainly open to digging in that way. But there are pieces of this book that I'm like, well, that's interesting, but I wouldn't want to bring that to the book talk crowd necessarily. So there are three buckets of research that this author, Annie Murphy-Paul, talks about. She is an author. Sometimes we talked about in one of these sessions, Arianna Huffington's book, Thrive. I mean, she's obviously a media mogul. We've had books by academics. She's really a writer, and she's a good writer, and the book reads well, I think. But it's not as though she's an academic who's done the research. She's somebody who's picked up the research. But I have heard her interviewed by several academics, including Adam Grant at the Wharton School, who just love the way she consolidates this research so concisely, and also gives the research its due. She doesn't fly over it at 10,000 feet, or else it would probably dismiss her. So the first bucket here is what she calls thinking with our bodies. And that includes, so there's three sections of the book with three chapters within each of the three sections, and they're divided just like this. So there's a chapter on thinking with sensations, on thinking with movement, and thinking with gesture. But first, broadly, what is the extended mind? And the extended mind means we're not just thinking in the modern Western sense of our thinking is in our heads and only in our heads. But there are tools and resources out there that enable us to think better, more effectively, less stressfully, more creatively. And that's what this book is largely about. So the first bucket, is about thinking with our bodies. So I'm going to read some passages to you here. When we clear away the hype, we confront the fact that the brain's capabilities are actually quite constrained and specific. The human brain is limited in its ability to pay attention, to remember, and to persist at a challenging task. That's why we need to think outside the brain. Thinking outside the brain means skillfully engaging entities external to our heads, the feelings and movements of our bodies, which is what this heading is about, the physical spaces in which we learn and work, which is what the second section is about, and the minds of other people around us, which is what the third section is about, and drawing all of these into our own mental processes. By reaching beyond the brain to recruit these extra neural resources, we're able to accomplish feats that would otherwise be impossible. It's kind of cool, right? I think it's interesting. The good news is that we've been doing this already. We've been doing it all along. We already think outside the brain. The bad news is that we tend to do it haphazardly, not as deliberately, as intentionally as we'd like. So we're not trained to use bodily movements and gestures to understand highly conceptual subjects in science and mathematics, for example, or to come up with novel or original ideas. Schools don't teach students how to restore their depleted energy with exposure to nature and the outdoors, or how to arrange their study spaces so they extend intelligent thought. We'll talk about that, extending intelligent thought. Teachers and managers don't demonstrate how abstract ideas can be turned into physical objects that can be manipulated and transformed to gain insights and solve problems. To the extent that we're using these objects outside of us, we're thinking outside the brain. Employees aren't shown how the social practices of imitation and vicarious learning can shortcut the process of acquiring expertise. That's talked about in the third section. Classroom groups and workplace teams aren't coached in scientifically validated methods of increasing collective intelligence. Our ability to think outside the brain has been left almost entirely uneducated and underdeveloped. So that's her thesis, is that by bringing in some of this research, we can find ways to think better by thinking in different ways. So in the first section about the extended mind, the author talks about thinking with sensation. So for example, what she's talking about for a period, a chunk of the book, is this notion of interoception, interoception, interoception. So what does that mean? According to Wikipedia, interoception is the sense of the internal state of the body. So this can be conscious or non-conscious. It encompasses the brain's process of integrating signals relayed from the body into specific subregions of the brain, allowing for a nuanced representation of the physiological state of the body. So in other words, it's our brain receiving signals from the body about what feels good, what feels right, happy, sad, emotions, things like that. But the senses of, and the sense of what's happening, we can be in tune with our bodies. How do we do that? The author talks about a body scan in true mindfulness fashion, the John Kabat-Zinn introduced body scan, just being aware of what's happening in our bodies. We can think with sensations. So what she says is just as we have sensors that take in information from the outside world, we have sensors inside our bodies that send our brains a constant flow of data from within. And these signals are generated all over internal organs, our muscles, even in our bones, she says, and then travel via multiple pathways to a part of our brain. Interoceptive awareness can be deliberately cultivated. Some simple exercises can put us in touch with these messages, including something like a body scan, to be aware of it. But the question becomes why, right? Why would we want to do this? So that's what she articulates here, and the research to back it up. It's important to recognize that the world is full of far more information than our conscious minds can process. So we want to be able to do this because consciously, we can't process all the information that there is in this world. It's a bit overwhelming. But fortunately, we're also able to collect and store the volumes of information we encounter on a non-conscious basis. And she goes on to list a number of different areas of research, including how we can perceive patterns without consciously recognizing that we're perceiving patterns. So a study led by a cognitive scientist, participants were directed to watch a computer screen on which a cross-shaped target would appear, then disappear, and then reappear in a new location. And people were asked to predict where the target was going to show up next. Over the course of several hours, the participants' predictions grew more and more accurate. They'd figured out the pattern between the target's movements, but they couldn't put it into words. Even if they were offered money to explain how they could predict where it was going to be next, they couldn't articulate that they had figured out the pattern. The movements of the target were operating according to a pattern too complex for the conscious mind to accommodate. But as she said, the capacious realm that lies below consciousness was far more than roomy enough to contain it. When a potentially relevant pattern is detected, it's our interoceptive faculty that tips us off. With a shiver or a sigh, a quickening of the breath, or a tensing of the muscles, the body is rung like a bell to alert us to this useful and otherwise inaccessible information. Though we typically think of the brain as telling the body what to do, the body also can guide the brain with an array of subtle nudges and prods. And she says, and the research shows in this book, people who are more aware of their bodily sensations are better able to make use of their non-conscious knowledge. Isn't that interesting? I think that's fascinating. It's really interesting. She also talks about the power of affect labeling, which was popularized by a book. I think it was a book called If You Can Name It, You Can Tame It. Some research that came out of UCLA and an academic there who has written a book about it. And I apologize, I'm not remembering the name. But also Dan Siegel, the psychologist, speaks often about If You Can Name It, You Can Tame It, just about reducing our stress, identifying what's causing anxiety with us, what do we want to focus on. If you can name it, you can tame it, what she calls affect labeling. And that helps us understand things better and manage things around us by labeling. Research shows that the simple act of giving a name to what we're feeling has a profound effect on the nervous system, immediately dialing down the body's stress response. Simply naming what's felt reduces activity in the amygdala, according to brain scanning studies, which is the brain structure involved in processing fear, the reptilian reactive fight or flight brain. And thinking in a more involved way, on the contrary, thinking in a more involved way about feelings and the experiences that evoke them. So in other words, if we focus on the things that upset us, this actually produces greater activity in the amygdala. So what we focus on out there impacts what happens inside our brain, thereby producing fight or flight tense responses or more calmness. And labeling takes things out of that reptilian brain. It creates some distance between ourselves and our emotions, which is actually quite consistent with the Positive Intelligence book that I've referred to before by Shirzad Chamine, which is a remarkable book about creating space between ourselves and our reactions or our judgmental inner voices that he calls saboteurs. I've talked about that before in this series. So that's one dimension of thinking with sensations. Thinking with movement, she talks about to get smart, get moving. So she cites research about moderate intensity exercise improves our ability to think both during and immediately following the activities. Research shows that benefits of moderate intensity exercise, not heavy duty stuff, but not too loungy either. Benefits include increased capacity to focus attention and resist distraction, greater verbal fluency and cognitive flexibility, enhanced problem-solving and decision-making abilities, and increased working memory and long-term memory for what is learned. So exercise creates these benefits for us. Something we might want to consider doing, movement. So she talks in the book about considering opportunities where we can use this in schools, where recess has been shown to be really helpful for students for their capability to learn, it would be bucking the trend in schools at this time, at least in the US, which is where most of her research is from, but not all of it. There's a lot of it that comes from Europe, some from Africa as well. But more sitting time is what's favored in schools now, when in fact recess would help kids learn and retain more of what they learn. So that's the thinking with movement piece, very, very important. She said, the easiest biohack in the world. Researchers at the Mayo Clinic determined that simply by standing rather than sitting, study participants expended 13% more energy and thought more clearly. That's one of the reasons I'm at a standing desk right now. Okay. Thinking with movement, we just discussed. Thinking with gesture is a very interesting one. she talks about how gesture is our first language, right? This is what babies learn first. Before they can walk, they're waving, beckoning, holding up their arms, pick me up, pointing at things, etc. But as we grow older, gestures tend to be devalued, if not just judged. Like gesturing isn't a good thing, to wave your hands, to point, something like that. But it turns out, she said, that gesture really matters, even for adults. Research shows that moving our hands advances our understanding of abstract or complex concepts, reduces our cognitive load. So by gesturing about one point or a range of thoughts, or consolidating our thinking or whatever, by gesturing, it reduces our cognitive load, in part because we're thinking to some extent with our hands. It also improves our memory. People are also more likely to remember what we've said when we deliver gestures along with our words. In one study, subjects who watched a videotaped speech were 33% more likely to recall a point from the talk if it was accompanied by a gesture. Something to think about when we're making presentations. I should be thinking about this too, because I want you to understand this. And it doesn't only apply when we're in person. A number of studies have demonstrated that instructional videos that include gesture produce significantly more learning for the people who watch them. Viewers direct their gaze more efficiently, they pay more attention to essential information, and they more readily transfer what they've learned to new situations. So we understand gesture more clearly than we understand words alone, and we can put it to greater use. I think that's fascinating. It's one of the things I really like with this book. It's good when children point. In our culture, we tend to downplay or even discourage it, but gestures lay the foundation for spoken language. There's a documented link between a child's rate of gesturing at a young age and the size of the child's vocabulary at 4 years of age. We should be encouraging it with our kids. So encourage kids to gesture. It helps us develop verbal ability, and it helps us to be understood more clearly. So that's thinking with gesture. And there's a section, obviously, like I said, there's a chapter on each of these in the book. I'd encourage you to take a look at it if you're more interested. In terms of, so I would ask these following questions with respect to this bucket of thinking with our bodies. In what ways can we develop our interoception abilities in order to be better attuned with what our bodies are sensing? For example, how can we create opportunities to practice affect labeling for ourselves, for our clients and stakeholders and bosses and our teams? How can we do that? What opportunities can we create to move, especially when we are at work? Understanding that at work means something different than it did a few years ago. What opportunities can we create? I was reading this book a few weeks ago in preparation for this talk. And last week, I led my first client offsite team meeting in 2 years. And one of the things that I did was I encouraged people to be walking while they were having some of these meaningful conversations. And they came back with very, very good feedback about the level of listening, what they remembered, and how enjoyable and connective it was. So I'm trying to put this to use right away. So what opportunities can we create to move or to encourage others to move? And where can we practice gesturing as we present and as we learn? Where can we practice that? So these are some questions to think about and reflect about this first section. Okay, part 2, thinking with our surroundings. The subheadings here are thinking with natural spaces, thinking with built spaces, and thinking with the space of ideas. So let's talk about what each of these means. The thinking with natural spaces is largely about how our thinking improves when we are in nature. She says the field of cognitive science commonly compares the human brain to a computer, but while a laptop works the same way, whether it's in an office or a park, the brain is deeply affected by the setting in which it operates. And nature provides particularly rich and fertile surroundings in which to think. Over hundreds of thousands of years of dwelling outside, the human organism became precisely calibrated to the characteristics of its verdant environment, tuning our minds to the frequencies of the organic world. So natural settings actually help us to think better, in part by relieving our stress and reestablishing our mental equilibrium. Drivers who travel along tree-lined roads, for example, recover more quickly from stressful experiences and handle emerging stresses with more calm compared to people who drive along roads crowded with billboards, buildings, and parking lots. The more stressed people are, the more benefit they derive from exposure to nature. This is very practical stuff. It helps us think better. Reduces rumination, calms us. I'm summarizing here. And another thing she cites is that nature works fast. So we generally have a sense that being in nature is good for us. It helps us calm down, etc. In fact, within 20 to 60 seconds of exposure to nature, our heart rate slows, our blood pressure drops, our breathing becomes more regular, and our brain activity becomes more relaxed. And she tells stories of very well-known creative people, authors, artists, etc., and how they got their inspiration. Jonas Salk, actually that comes up later in the Built Spaces section, got great inspiration from being outside. It clears our heads. My experience has been that as well, that to see the trees roll by, whether I'm on a train or driving, is a way of calming me and shifts my brain away from thinking about specific details to broader. My imagination wanders, I think, more creatively when I see trees flowing by. I remember thinking about that on many Amtrak trains in the Northeast US. What's that about? And this book explains why. So that's thinking with natural spaces. We think better, and it reduces our stress. Thinking with built spaces is actually one thing she talks about. Built spaces meaning to be in buildings, and how privacy really helps us. It helps us in our work. And she makes the distinction between the intention of constructing open space workspaces and where everybody is out in a common space, and how, that can be really helpful for communication, but it's not helpful for concentration, and it's not helpful for doing our best thinking. True, people who work near one another are more likely to communicate and collaborate. Fruitful proximity is one thing, she says, but continual distraction is another. She said the open plan workspace is in direct conflict with the realities of human biology, especially when it comes to performing complex, cognitively demanding work, which, as much of this book suggests, is what a lot of us are doing, cognitively demanding work. So what she says, according to with human biology, the brain evolved to let me start again. Maybe I should gesture. That would help me think more clearly. The brain evolved to continually monitor its immediate environment, to be, in effect, distractible, because nearby sounds or movements might signal a danger to be avoided or an opportunity to be seized. So we pay attention to what's happening around us. That's the way we're wired. And organizational environments are full of the kind of stimuli that distract us most. So the thinking with built spaces is about minimizing distractions and recognizing what distracts us. Humans are especially attuned to the presence of novelty, right? So we notice things that are new. So that's a problem when we operate in environments that are centers of constant activity and change. It's who's going to walk through, what are they going to be saying? We're attracted to newness. So we need to be thinking about that in terms of where we can work to be most productive. We're also especially attuned to the sound of speech. So again, to be in a place where people are talking around us is to distract us and draw our attentions away. That's just the way we're wired. And we're also especially attuned to the nuances of social interaction. If people are having conversations, especially in discernible voices, not just a murmur in the background or something, we're more likely to be drawn to that and distracted by that. So if you're constantly finding it challenging to get your work done, Consider changing the environment to allow for some privacy, thereby reducing distraction. And there's an additional benefit, she says, as one neuroscientist's research has shown, when people are relieved of the cognitive load imposed by their environment. So in other words, they're not distracted, they're not partially occupied by what's happening around them, they immediately become more creative. So thinking with built spaces is something that's available to us. Let me see if there's anything else. She says we have to rely on physical space to save us from our own propensity for distraction. We have to impose some type of sensory reduction that supports our optimal attention, memory, and cognition. She said Robert Frost wrote, "Good fences make good neighbors." I thought that was interesting. Thinking with the space of ideas. So in this section, this is a little interesting. I'm going to flip up to a different page here. You may hear pages turning. So the space of ideas is interesting. She talks about people who are the champions of contests around memory, people who have the best memories in the world that we can use. She said, the strategy of tying new information to pre-existing memories of physical space is the key to the extraordinary performance of what she calls memory athletes. So we can remember things by tying them to physical spaces. Just as if we can say, if you're imagining a favorite vacation or a conversation you have with someone that's particularly memorable, it's often connected to a particular space because we associate memories, experiential memories with certain spaces. And that's something that can be cultivated. This repurposing of our sense of physical space to navigate through purely mental structures is reflected in the language we use every day. This is interesting. We say the future lies up ahead. The past is behind us. We endeavor to stay on top of things and not to get out of our depth. We reach for a lofty goal or stoop low to commit a disreputable act. And this is evidence of how we habitually understand and interact with the world around us. And she refers to that as spatial thinking, and that can substitute for abstract thought, which I think is quite interesting. And where is that example that she was talking about? Yeah, so she cites psychologist Barbara Tversky, who says, when thought overwhelms the mind uses the world. So how can we use physical space to spread out material? It talks about, there's some stories in here about a historian, as well as some other notable politicians, et cetera, who would do things like set up a large board in their office. I think about some of these crime shows that put up pictures of suspects and clues and things. And by putting all this information out there, we can remember it better. And we can assemble ideas and look at our own thinking and our own patterns by depicting them and using physical space. So by thinking with the space of ideas, as she calls it, we can offload some of what we're thinking and depict it in a space, and that benefits us. So turning the mental map of a book that an author might have into an artifact outside. He said the author said that this extended his ability to think. Looking it over, he could now see far more clearly and concretely than if the map had remained in his head how his ideas related to one another, how the many paths taken by the narrative twist and turn, diverge and converge. And she refers to that as concept mapping, I think, which is an interesting idea. Concept mapping. So the way we would use a mind map, for example, or a fishboning of ideas that we might talk about for decision making, that's what this is about. We're using the physical space to help us organize our thoughts. And to do that is to offload, is to reduce our thinking load, because we're putting this out there. I think that's a fascinating idea, and there's much in the book about this. Definitely would encourage you to look at that if you're interested. This also connects really well when I hear about offloading with the work of David Allen, author of Getting Things Done, a wonderful, wonderful book about personal productivity and focus, about the need to regularly offload and do a mind dump to get things out of our heads, to offload things. And thereby it helps us focus on what's most important and not be distracted by everything that's in our brains. As David Allen says, I've heard him say this, our mind is a great, great, great tool for coming up with new ideas and a terrible tool for remembering. And therefore, let's use the space around us. And that's what this part C here is talking about. So some questions to think about with respect to thinking with our surroundings. How can we put ourselves and our teams in nature? How can we create enough privacy so that we can focus and think while maintaining enough shared space to effectively connect and interact? And how can we modify our spaces so as to encourage comfort and remind us of who we are and who we'd like to be in this environment? And for that last point, let me just refer to something I forgot to mention earlier. She talks about how our spaces influence our identities. Each of us has many identities, and the cues in our environment evoke those different identities. Do we have cues in our environment that are family photographs, that are mementos or diplomas or awards of recognition that point to our identity as a professional or as accomplished in some way? Do we have a photograph that takes us back to a birthplace or a space that means something to us, that conjures up a different dimension of our identity? By modifying these spaces around us, we can shift the level of comfort that we have, relax our brains a bit. It's very, very disruptive, she writes in here and cites some research, when our office spaces are rearranged or when we're working in places that don't feel comfortable or that don't feel encouraging to us or reminding us or reflecting back to us the identity and the part of us that we want to bring forward in this environment. So modifying these spaces within our surroundings in the built spaces is very good for our productivity and our focus and reducing our stress. So that's where that last question comes from. How do we modify our spaces so as to encourage comfort and remind us who we are and who we'd like to be in a particular environment? All right, let's go to part 3, thinking with our relationships. This is about thinking with experts, thinking with peers, and thinking with groups. She writes, our culture and our institutions tend to fixate on the individual. In business and education and public and private life, we emphasize individual competition over joint cooperation. But individual cognition is simply not sufficient to meet the challenges of a world in which information is so abundant, expertise is so specialized, and issues are so complex. A single mind laboring on its own is at a distinct disadvantage in solving problems or generating new ideas. We need to work with what she calls the group mind. And the key lies in creating real-time encounters in which people act and feel together in close physical proximity. So what's interesting here is that the chapter that it just completed is about having enough privacy to do our own thinking, but to recognize that there are many times where we need to be with groups to do our best thinking. We think differently and often better when we think as part of a close-knit group rather than as individuals. And what she says is, and this is with respect to thinking with peers, the part B, it's particularly the case regarding our attention and motivation. So shared attention is the expression in quotes. That occurs when we focus on the same objects or information at the same time as others. The awareness that we are focusing on a particular stimulus along with others leads our brains to endow that stimulus with special significance. So to our brains, something is more important if we're paying attention to it with other people. I think about that, whether it's in terms of shared focus on a particular piece of information. Hey, let's look at this together. Or whether we can study something together or discuss a report together. Our brains put more importance on things that we experience with other people. I think that's really interesting. We then allocate more mental bandwidth to that material, processing it more deeply. And as a result, we both learn and remember things better when we attend to them with other people. I think that's fascinating and really quite interesting. So in addition to attention, she says, motivation is also different when we participate with other people. Our willingness to persevere can be enhanced when our efforts are made on behalf of a group we care about. That seems fair. I've worked with people about that. Well, maybe it's not that important to me, but it's important to some people I care about. Therefore, I'll take action in support of something. Membership in a group can be a potent source of motivation if we feel a genuine sense of belonging to the group and if our personal identity feels firmly tied to the group and its success. So I can be motivated by belonging to a group if I feel really part of that group. That's good news if we can feel part of that group or if we can cultivate that sense of belonging. It's bad news if there's exclusion happening or bias or people feel like outsiders. But when these conditions are met, group membership acts as a form of intrinsic motivation. So our behavior becomes driven by factors internal to the task, such as the satisfaction we get from contributing to a collective effort, rather than by external rewards such as money or public recognition. So if we feel a sense of belonging in connection with a group, we'll be more motivated by the intrinsic value of the task. And intrinsic motivation goes farther than extrinsic motivation. I've read about that many times before. Intrinsic motivation is more powerful, more enduring, and more easily maintained than the extrinsic sort. It leads us to experience the work as more enjoyable and to perform it more capably. Talking with peers is something I also wanted to highlight here. So, again, she's writing about we live in an every man for himself society, and we emphasize individual achievement, but in doing so, we fail to reap the rich benefits of shared attention and shared motivation. She says people who need to think together should learn together, in person at the same time if possible. People who need to think together should train together in person at the same time. Training together can reduce the silo effect, which is where people fail to communicate or collaborate across different departments. We're less likely to operate in silos if we train together. And I think this is really interesting. People who need to think together should feel together in person at the same time. This is interesting too. I wonder if you've experienced this. I have. Emotionally distressing or physically painful events can act as a kind of social glue that bonds people together if they experience them together. Right? So if we've been through a tough experience together, we connect, we gel, we bond because of that challenging experience. Doesn't mean we want to create a bad situation or a dangerous situation, but it is true that if we experience something like that together, it can bring us closer. Studies have also determined that simply asking members to candidly share their thoughts and feelings with one another leads to improvements in group cohesion and performance. And I've done this many times with teams in my work in terms of team alignment. Asking people to just be open with one another leads to improved cohesion and performance. This is thinking with peers and thinking with groups. And people, as she writes, people who need to think together should engage in rituals together in person at the same time. Ritual could be anything. It could be people walking together, running together. It could be people in some type of ceremony of some kind. It could be rituals like communicating a certain thing in the workplace when somebody shares a good idea. It could be giving appreciation in a certain way. When we do that together, we connect. It brings people together. And as she writes, and this is maybe very obvious, even so ordinary a ritual as sharing a meal can make a difference in how well a group thinks together. We have a sense of comfort with people. We're open with people. It improves our thinking. So as she says, remember, we're not unfeeling machines. We're creatures of the world, intimately connected to our bodies, to our surroundings, to the other people in our lives. This improves our thinking. Also, with respect to thinking with peers, she talks about constructive controversy. So research suggests that constructive intellectual conflict in the classroom helps students engage. So some level of healthy conflict helps people engage more in the classroom. And that's because conflict creates uncertainty. And this type of ambiguity can compel students to acquire more facts. And the piece I wanted to talk about with this is about active learning in courses. So having students act out, embody, reflect back learning and concepts rather than simply read or discuss concepts. Whether it's in what's in the research called multiple brief small group discussions and other types of active learning helps students learn. Research demonstrates that students who engage in active learning acquire a deeper understanding of the material, score higher on exams, and are less likely to fail or drop out. And this is something that I've read about in the past. I think it's a great point made here. The development of intelligent thinking is fundamentally a social process. Learning is social. We can engage in thinking on our own, of course, and at times solitary cognition is what's called for by a particular problem or project. But our brains evolve to think with people, to teach them, to argue with them, to exchange stories with them. Human thought is exquisitely sensitive to context, and one of the most powerful contexts of all is the presence of other people. So when we think socially, we think differently and often better than when we think non-socially. Social memories are encoded in a distinct part of the brain. It goes on to talk about a number of other things, including, in terms of thinking with groups, when we teach something, and I've heard this before, years ago, if you want to really learn something, teach it to somebody else. When we teach, we review concepts in our heads. We think differently. We anticipate concerns and problems. We think about things. It's an interesting thing. Benefits of teaching other people. She cites research. Firstborn children have an IQ that is on average 2.3 points higher than that of their younger brothers and sisters. All right, and why is that? Researchers have concluded that the firstborn children's higher IQ stems from a simple fact of family life. They engage in teaching younger siblings. And research has shown that, for example, when explaining academic content, we're forced to make explicit the details that we may ourselves have glossed over. We fill the gaps in our own knowledge, and our understanding becomes more visible. That's what teaching makes us do. Researchers have found that while students often possess the mental tools required to understand challenging academic content, they simply don't apply them when studying on their own. But when placed in the role of teacher, students are compelled to put these tools to use with previously unrealized benefits for their own learning. So I think that's a fascinating thing. So I think we knew that, but again, this is a thread of research that she buckets together in terms of thinking together, thinking with our relationships. And finally, she talks about a substantial body of research showing that behavioral synchrony, meaning coordinating our actions so that they're like the actions of others, primes us for what we can call cognitive synchrony, multiple people thinking together efficiently and effectively. So how can we create opportunities to do that, to move with people, to move with our peers, to move with our customers, clients, because that helps us connect. That's the way we're wired. So some questions to think about. How can we create more useful constructive task conflict? How can we have more opportunities to train and learn together? Now, I might add to that list, where can we create opportunities to teach as a way of building our own understanding? as a way of teach to build our own understanding? Those are some of the questions that I would take away from this section. So, as I said, I certainly would welcome any questions you have on any portion of this book or any of this content. And also, in addition to referring back to David Allen and Dan Siegel and their work, I'd also suggest that this book also refers me back to something I heard Jean Houston talk about many years ago, about 25, 27 years ago. And she talked about how if you think about our brains, our physiology, now, in the present, compared to 100 years ago, it's essentially the same. We really haven't evolved very much in terms of our neurology, our mental capacity, et cetera. If you think about the world that we live in now versus 100 years ago, it's exponentially busier, more stressful, exponentially more stimuli. We've had to deal with, balance out, sort through many more stressors. I'm not saying we live in a worse case than we did, a worse situation than we did 100 years ago, but the amount that we have to manage and balance, manage through, resolve, level off, level with, is quite different than 100 years ago. And the way she put it, Jean Houston, that is that we need to learn to cook on more burners. She was talking about a number of other things, including intuition and the like. But this book talks about that in the same way, without using that language. But I like her metaphor. We need to learn to cook on more burners. In this case, the burners are our bodies, our surroundings, and our relationships. And we can engage these things to help ourselves think better. I think it's a provocative, interesting book, a lot of pieces to it. And I invite any comments or questions you might have. And I'm glad that I was able to get through a lot of content fairly quickly in this conversation. So I look forward to continuing the conversation, and we will see you next month.